The galaxy had evolved far beyond the bounds of Earth's atmosphere. Humanity, once confined to a small blue planet in the Milky Way, had spread across countless star systems. But even as humanity reached out to the stars, it remained, to many, a mysterious and often underestimated species. Alien races that had existed for millennia viewed humans with a mix of curiosity and condescension. Few saw them as equals. The year was 2567, and the galaxy had become a vast network of political intrigues, military conflicts, and shifting alliances. Technology had advanced to unimaginable heights, with entire planets governed by artificial intelligence and societies thriving under the watchful eyes of powerful alien species. Yet in the vast expanse of the stars, one thing remained constant: power. And in the hierarchy of the galaxy, humanity had little to offer. On the planet of Xanthar, the humans were confined to a harsh reality. Their place in the galaxy was as laborers, servants, and subjugated beings. It was here, on this world of towering alien architecture and sprawling cities, that Aminata's story began. A world far removed from the dusty streets and vibrant culture of Earth. The air was heavy, polluted with the fumes of industrial machines. The skies, perpetually shrouded in the purple haze of the planet's atmosphere, seemed to press down on the people below, creating a feeling of suffocation. The streets were filled with the hum of alien technology and the distant rumble of military machinery. Aminata had never known freedom. She had been born on Xanthar to a family struggling to survive under the weight of an oppressive regime. Her father had once been a proud man, a leader among his people, but he had been taken away by the alien overlords for speaking out against the system. Her mother, a quiet woman of unshakable strength, had raised Aminata alone. Yet even her mother's resilience couldn't protect Aminata from the harsh realities of the world around her. As a young girl, she had dreamed of escape, of a life where she was more than a servant, where she could be free to explore the stars and experience a life untainted by the weight of oppression. But as the years passed, her dreams faded into the backdrop of survival. She had learned early on that the only way to endure was to keep your head down, to stay out of the way of the aliens who ruled their lives with an iron fist. The planet of Xanthar, like many others in the galaxy, had been colonized by alien forces long before humanity had made its mark on the stars. The alien races that had claimed dominion over Earth's colonies were from all corners of the galaxy, each with their own distinct cultures, languages, and ideologies. Among them were the Zorvash, a tall, imposing race with skin the color of deep blue stone. Their advanced technology and military prowess had made them the dominant force in this sector of the galaxy. It was the Zorvash who had brought humanity to Xanthar, forcing them into servitude and establishing a rigid caste system where humans were little more than tools for their masters. Aminata was just one of many humans who lived in servitude, performing menial tasks for the Zorvash and other alien species who occupied the planet. Her life was one of quiet submission, her every action dictated by the will of her alien overlords. She had no say in her own fate, and every day was a struggle to survive, to remain invisible, to avoid the wrath of the Zorvash soldiers who patrolled the streets. But deep within there was something that set Aminata apart from the others, a fire, a determination. It was not enough to simply exist. She would not allow herself to be erased by the indifferent machine of oppression that ground down the lives of those around her. Despite the dark circumstances of her world, she carried the memories of her ancestors, stories of resistance, of strength, of survival against overwhelming odds. The fire in her heart was a testament to the strength of her heritage, a heritage she would one day embrace fully when the time came. As the Zorvash tightened their grip on Xanthar and the other planets they controlled, Aminata would come to realize that the galaxy was much more than the small, suffocating world she had known. And in the midst of that realization, her path would cross with someone who would change everything. A commander from an alien race she had never expected to meet. Someone who would see her not as a servant, not as a tool, but as something more. This was the beginning of something that would ripple across the galaxy, a story of love, rebellion, and the clash of cultures. The beginning of a journey that would defy the expectations of all who thought they understood what it meant to be human. Jarek had always known the weight of command. As the leader of one of the most elite military units in the galaxy, his life was defined by discipline, strategy, and power. The Zorvash Empire had bred him for this role from a young age, carving his mind and body into a perfect weapon of war. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features that mirrored the cold blue stone of his people. His eyes, though, those deep, piercing eyes, held more than the calculating precision of a soldier. They hid something else, something the Empire could never teach him to suppress, a longing for something beyond victory. His rise through the ranks had been swift and not without cost. The Zorvash Empire didn't reward weakness. It demanded perfection. And yet, in his climb to the top, Jarek had learned that the true price of power wasn't just the sacrifices of others, it was the erosion of his own humanity. He had grown numb to the faces of the soldiers he had led into battle, to the cries of the fallen. He had silenced his conscience, buried any semblance of empathy beneath the polished exterior of a commander. But in the quiet moments, when the stars hung like distant diamonds in the inky void outside his ship's viewport, Jarek's mind wandered. He had begun to question the very system he served. Why had he devoted himself to this empire? What was the point of endless conquest if it only led to more conquest? Was there something more? The Zorvash had conquered countless worlds, subjugating species they deemed inferior. Humans were no different. Jarek had long seen them as little more than tools, efficient but weak. He had been taught that humanity was a species best left to its own devices, to serve the stronger, more advanced civilizations. The humans' potential for rebellion, their strange resilience, was nothing but a nuisance, a factor to be dealt with in time. Yet, in the corridors of the command ship, the weight of his role never seemed so heavy. The alien officers who surrounded him were just as ruthless, just as driven by ambition, but none of them seemed to question the endless cycle of violence they perpetuated. They didn't care about the cost of their actions, the millions of lives ruined in their pursuit of power. And so, Jarek had become disillusioned. It was during a routine military inspection on Xanthar that Jarek first saw her, Aminata. She had been one of many human workers assigned to clean the upper levels of the Imperial compound, performing tasks deemed too menial for the alien officers. He had barely noticed her at first, his attention consumed by the broader operations. But when their eyes met for the briefest of moments, something shifted. The glance was fleeting, and yet it felt like the universe had paused just for that instant. Aminata's defiance wasn't obvious, not in the way she spoke or moved, but in the quiet strength that radiated from her. There was a depth to her gaze, an intelligence that made her stand apart from the other human workers. She was not a mere servant. She was something more. Jarek found himself intrigued. He hadn't realized how far he had fallen until that moment. He hadn't realized how much he longed for something to challenge his view of the galaxy, to push against the rigid expectations of his people. He didn't act on it immediately. He couldn't. There was too much at stake. A commander like him, with his reputation and position, could never afford to show weakness. But the memory of her eyes lingered in his mind long after the inspection was over, gnawing at him. Days passed, and the thought of Aminata remained at the back of his mind, simmering in his thoughts like an ember that refused to die. The cold logic of his existence, the calculated movements of his every action, seemed less clear now. He had seen thousands of faces throughout his career, warriors, diplomats, leaders, all playing their parts in the grand scheme of the Empire. But Aminata, she was different. She wasn't playing a part. And so Jarek found himself facing an internal conflict. He could continue along his path, following the commands of his superiors, ensuring the stability of the Zorvash Empire. Or he could do something he had never done before, follow his own path, listen to the stirring within him and risk everything. But one thing was certain, his encounter with Aminata had awakened something he had buried for too long. As the days passed, Jarek found himself becoming more distracted, more torn. He had always been able to ignore his emotions, bury them beneath his sense of duty. But now, with the weight of her gaze lingering, it was becoming harder to dismiss the questions he had long avoided. He didn't know it yet, but the encounter with Aminata would change everything, and it was only a matter of time before he would have to choose. Would he remain the cold, unyielding commander, or would he follow the stirring of his heart, no matter where it led? Aminata moved through the halls of the Zorvash Imperial compound with practiced precision, her footsteps light, her posture rigid, with a quiet defiance that few would recognize. The human workers on Xanthar were not treated as equals, but as tools meant to serve and remain unseen. It was a life she had come to accept, but never one she had embraced. Her task was simple: clean, maintain, and remain invisible. The alien officers who occupied the higher levels of the compound rarely glanced at her or the other human workers, treating them with the same disinterest one might show a piece of furniture. Yet there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Aminata's gaze would linger on the world beyond the towering walls of the Zorvash structures, imagining what it might be like to live freely, to breathe without the weight of servitude. She had always been quiet, reserved in her demeanor, but her mind was anything but still. Inside her, there was a fire, an unspoken strength cultivated from years of survival in a system that sought to crush her spirit. She was the descendant of those who had fought for freedom, for dignity. The echoes of her ancestors' struggles reverberated within her, even if the world around her wanted to silence them. Her family had once been part of a thriving community on Earth, but the rise of the Zorvash and other alien races had shattered that world. Now her family's name was little more than a forgotten whisper in the winds of history. The Zorvash had taken everything: her home, her people, her freedom. All that was left was this servitude. Yet Aminata was not a woman who allowed herself to be defined by the chains of the past. Her movements were precise, but her mind was always active. She paid attention to everything: the way the Zorvash officers spoke, the way they moved, the subtle dynamics of power that rippled through the compound. She was learning. And though her world was confined to the walls of the compound, her mind reached far beyond it. The routine was suffocating, but it was what kept her alive. The Zorvash never expected much from their human workers. All they wanted was obedience. For the most part, they got it, but there was a quiet rebellion inside Aminata. It was not loud or overt, but it was there, growing every day. She had learned to make herself invisible, to avoid drawing attention, to avoid the brutal punishments that awaited those who stepped out of line. But in her heart, there was a constant hunger for something more. One afternoon, while cleaning the command center, she caught sight of him. Jarek. At first, it was nothing more than a brief exchange of glances. She had seen him before, of course. He was the commander, one of the most powerful figures in the Zorvash military. His presence was imposing, his every movement deliberate and filled with authority. But there was something different about him that day. She noticed the slight furrow of his brow, the way his eyes scanned the room with a deep, almost searching look. For a moment, their eyes met. Just for a second. Aminata immediately lowered her gaze, returning to her task, but something had shifted. Her heartbeat quickened, and a strange unease settled in the pit of her stomach. She didn't know why, but she could sense it. He was watching her, and she was certain it wasn't just because she was another worker in his path. There was an intensity in his gaze that was difficult to ignore. Jarek had always been a man of control. Everything he did, everything he said was calculated. He had learned to mask his emotions, to bury them beneath the armor of his rank. But something about Aminata had shaken him. There was something raw, something real about her, that no amount of military discipline or alien superiority could dismiss. As the days passed, Aminata tried to shake off the feeling. It was irrational to think that the commander, someone so far beyond her, had any interest in her. But the more she saw him, the more she couldn't deny the pull. There was something magnetic about him, a depth to his presence that she couldn't explain. The tension was unspoken but palpable. Every time they crossed paths, their eyes would meet, if only for a fraction of a second. And each time Aminata felt that same uneasy flutter in her chest. She had learned long ago to ignore feelings like these. They were dangerous, especially in a place like this, where a single misstep could cost her everything. But even in the quiet corners of her mind, Aminata knew one thing. The encounter had changed something, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't push it away. It was a feeling she couldn't control, a thread of fate that had woven itself into her life. Jarek was the commander of the Zorvash military, an untouchable figure, and she was just a maid, a servant, someone meant to be invisible. But something inside Aminata was stirring, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. The day Aminata's life took a drastic turn started like any other, mundane, predictable, and suffocating. The Imperial compound was just as cold as it always was, its towering metallic walls casting long shadows over the sterile, oppressive streets. The air was thick with a humid heat, the kind that clung to the skin and left a faint, persistent sting in the back of the throat. The scent of machinery, oil, and chemicals filled the air, a constant reminder of the alien presence that suffocated this world. Aminata had been assigned to clean the high-ranking officers' quarters that day. She moved swiftly, silently as she always did, her mind focused on the task at hand. She scrubbed the floors, wiped down the walls, and ensured that every corner was spotless. The Zorvash officers rarely paid attention to the humans who served them, but Aminata had learned to never take that for granted. Her every movement was precise, calculated to avoid drawing attention. Being invisible was the key to surviving another day, but that morning something shifted in the air, something she couldn't quite explain. She had just finished polishing the windows when the door to the officers' quarters opened unexpectedly. The Zorvash officer who entered was one she didn't recognize, tall with sharp angular features, his dark blue skin almost blending into the shadows of the room. He wore the insignia of a higher rank than most, his uniform pristine and adorned with symbols of his power. Without warning, the officer stopped in front of Aminata, his eyes narrowing. She froze, her heart racing in her chest. She was careful, always careful not to provoke the officers, but today something was different. He was glaring at her, his eyes studying her with a disturbing intensity. "Human," he growled, his voice deep and laced with venom. "What are you doing here?" Aminata's throat tightened. She had been caught off guard. She knew the consequences of being caught in the wrong place. Punishment was inevitable. But she could not afford to let her fear show. She had to keep her composure. I'm cleaning, sir," she stammered, her hands trembling as she wiped a cloth across the window for a second time. She felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead, but she refused to look up. The officer circled her, his steps deliberate like a predator toying with its prey. "You're cleaning. But why are you still here? This room has been inspected." His voice was filled with contempt, the words sharp as a blade. Aminata swallowed hard, struggling to control her breathing. She couldn't explain the sense of dread that clung to the room, but she could feel it. Something was wrong. His gaze was cold, unyielding, and it didn't just linger on her, it pinned her in place. "I'll finish immediately, sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused for a moment, and for a heartbeat she thought he might leave. But instead he stepped forward. The sound of his heavy boots echoed in the room, making her skin crawl. His hand reached out, grabbing her by the arm in a vice-like grip. The shock of his touch sent a jolt of fear through her. She tried to pull away, but his strength was too much. She could barely breathe under the weight of his hold. "You are worthless," he spat, his face inches from hers. "A useless slave." Aminata's heart pounded in her chest, the harsh words cutting through her like a blade. But she refused to show weakness. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Suddenly the door swung open and another officer entered the room, a look of surprise on his face as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on here?" the new officer demanded. The first officer immediately released his grip on Aminata, his eyes flashing with anger. He straightened up, hiding his earlier aggression behind a mask of professionalism. "This human was out of line," the officer said, his voice now calm but laced with an unsettling edge. "She was caught in an area she shouldn't have been. She's a threat to the order here." Aminata's heart sank. She knew what this meant. It was a claim so easily believed, and the punishment for such an offense was swift and fatal. The second officer didn't question the accusation, his eyes scanning the room before nodding in agreement. "Take her to the holding cells. She'll be dealt with immediately." Aminata's breath hitched in her throat. She had never expected this. She had always been careful, always kept her head down. But today, for reasons she couldn't understand, she had been singled out. She was being taken to the cells for something she hadn't even done. The officers roughly seized her arms and dragged her out of the room. She struggled to keep her composure, her heart racing in terror. Her mind raced, but all she could think of was how everything was slipping out of her control. She had become just another casualty in the vast machine of the Zorvash Empire. And as they led her down the cold metallic hallways, her thoughts went to the one person who might have the power to stop this, to save her. But Jarek was the last person she expected to help her. He was the commander, and she was just a maid. There was no room in his world for someone like her. But even as she was dragged away, a tiny, flickering hope burned in the depths of her heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't completely alone. Jarek stood at the edge of the command center, his fingers drumming lightly against the cold metal of the control panel in front of him. The hum of the ship's engines reverberated beneath his feet, a constant reminder of the overwhelming power the Zorvash held over the galaxy. Yet, in that moment, he couldn't shake the disquiet that gnawed at him. The images of Aminata, her defiant gaze, her quiet strength, kept replaying in his mind. There was no logical explanation for why he couldn't rid himself of the thought of her. She was just a maid, a servant to the Zorvash military, nothing more than a tool in the machinery of their empire. But Jarek had seen something in her that he hadn't seen in anyone else. Something human. Something real. He paced back and forth in the command room, his mind racing. He had faced countless battles, commanded thousands of soldiers, and made decisions that had shaped the course of wars. But none of those decisions had ever weighed on him the way this one did. Saving Aminata would mean defying everything he had ever stood for. It would mean risking his position, his reputation, and everything he had worked so hard to build. Jarek's eyes wandered to the large viewport, where the swirling clouds of a distant planet could be seen in the distance. Xanthar, the planet that had become a symbol of oppression for so many. It was there that he had first encountered Aminata, and it was there that his perception of the galaxy, of humanity, had begun to shift. He had known that the humans on Xanthar were subjugated, but he had never really considered what that meant for them. Now the weight of it was impossible to ignore. The Zorvash had never cared about the human population. To them, they were nothing more than tools, useful in their place, expendable when no longer needed. Yet in her eyes, Jarek had seen something different. There was no fear. No submission. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, a strength that seemed impossible in such a brutal world. His mind flickered back to the scene earlier that day, when Aminata had been dragged through the hallways of the compound. The officers had been ruthless, pulling her away as though she were nothing more than an object. Jarek had stood by and watched it all unfold, unable to act. But now, as he stood in the silence of the command center, he realized he couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. He had to make a choice. He knew that interfering in this way could cost him everything. The Zorvash Empire did not tolerate disobedience. Disloyalty could lead to death, not just for him, but for those close to him as well. And yet the thought of doing nothing filled him with a sense of emptiness. How could he continue to serve a system that treated people like Aminata with such cruelty? How could he live with himself knowing he had the power to act and chose to do nothing? A deep sigh escaped his lips as his eyes fell to the floor. The choice had never been more clear. It was time to break free from the rigid chains that had bound him for so long. Time to make a decision that would change everything. "I won't let them do this to her," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. Jarek's mind made up. He immediately began making preparations. He would need to act swiftly, carefully. His plan wasn't just about saving Aminata. It was about making a statement, about defying a system that had long been built on the subjugation of those it deemed lesser. He wasn't just saving a single person. He was taking a stand against everything that had kept him chained to a world of indifference and cruelty. He moved quickly, his resolve firm. There was no turning back now. Jarek knew the risks involved. He had calculated them all. He would have to take full responsibility for his actions, and there would be consequences. But for the first time in a long while, the weight of the decision didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. "Prepare the transport," Jarek ordered to one of his officers, his voice steady, unwavering. "We're going to Xanthar." The officer hesitated for a moment, uncertainty flickering in their eyes, but quickly nodded in compliance. The decision had been made. There was no room for second guessing. As Jarek walked toward the ship's command deck, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something unfamiliar. It was not fear nor doubt, but something closer to hope. He was about to defy everything he had known. He was about to make a choice that would change his life, and perhaps the fate of the galaxy, forever. Aminata had never imagined this. After the brutal treatment she endured in the Imperial compound, she had expected the holding cells to be her final resting place. The officers had made it clear that no one was spared from the Empire's cruelty, not even a lowly human maid. But when the door to her cell had opened, and the shadow of the officer in charge had loomed over her, she had prepared herself for the worst. Instead, a name, Jarek, had cut through the silence like a sudden storm. She hadn't recognized him at first. She knew of him, of course, the commander of the Zorvash military, a figure of immense power and authority. His presence was like a weight in the room, one that could crush anything or anyone beneath it. Yet, when he spoke, there was an uncertainty in his eyes, a hesitation that she had not expected from someone of his rank. "You're coming with me?" Jarek had said simply, his voice cold, but with an undercurrent that she could not place. The guards had looked at each other in confusion, clearly unsure of what to make of the command, but Jarek's position, his reputation, allowed for no argument. They stepped aside, leaving her to be taken out of the cell and into the unknown. It was happening too quickly for her to fully grasp, and all she could do was follow. Now, as they stood in the sterile, dimly lit hallways of the transport ship, Aminata couldn't help but wonder if she was dreaming. Jarek's cold demeanor, his unreadable expression, did nothing to calm the whirlwind of confusion inside her. He had saved her. Of that, she was certain. But why? What did he want from her? What had possessed him to go against the very system he had sworn to uphold? "Why are you doing this?" Aminata asked, her voice shaking slightly, a mixture of gratitude and suspicion flooding her chest. "Why save me? I'm nothing, just a maid." Her words echoed in the quiet room, and she instantly regretted them. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and it made her stomach tighten. Jarek remained silent for a long moment, as though trying to find the right words. His face, usually so stern and controlled, was momentarily softened by something unspoken. "You're not just a maid," Jarek finally said, his voice steady but low. "I couldn't just stand by and watch them do this to you." Aminata's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard anyone, especially someone of his status, speak so openly to her. The Zorvash never cared about humans beyond their usefulness. To them, she was nothing more than a cog in a machine. She was a tool, meant to serve and then be discarded. "Why me?" she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Jarek exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering briefly toward the cold, metallic walls of the transport. "I don't know, something about you, something in the way you carried yourself. It made me realize that I can't continue being part of this." His words were unexpected. She had heard stories, of course, about those in power questioning the system. But this was something different. Jarek was no rebel. He was a high-ranking officer in the Zorvash military, a man who had built his career on obedience, on dominance. What was it that had made him question everything? Aminata shook her head, trying to make sense of the situation. She had been prepared to die. She had accepted that fate, as many humans under the Zorvash rule did. But now she was caught in a whirlwind she couldn't escape, pulled in by a man whose motives were as unclear as the stars outside. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice still shaky. "I don't understand. You're risking everything for someone like me." Jarek didn't answer immediately. His eyes, those deep, unreadable eyes, seemed to search the depths of her soul, as if he were looking for an answer that he didn't have himself. Finally he spoke, his voice soft, but filled with an intensity that made her shiver. "Because I don't want to be that man anymore," Jarek confessed quietly. "The one who stands by and lets things happen. I want to change things. For both of us." Aminata felt her breath catch in her throat. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his words, but the confusion inside her only deepened. What was he asking for? And more importantly, what did he expect from her? How could someone like him, someone so ingrained in the very system that oppressed her, possibly understand what it meant to be human? The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, as the transport ship hummed softly in the background. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but something held her back. Jarek had freed her from certain death. For that alone, she owed him a debt she could never repay. But what did he want in return? That was the question that lingered, unanswered. Aminata couldn't shake the feeling that something deep inside her had changed. She was no longer just a maid. She was no longer just a survivor. She was something else now. A symbol, perhaps. And Jarek, despite the confusion, had become an unlikely ally in her struggle for something more. In the days that followed Aminata's rescue, the air between her and Jarek remained thick with unspoken questions. He had brought her aboard his personal transport ship, and they were now far away from the suffocating grip of Xanthar's oppressive regime. The journey was quiet, the hum of the ship's engines a constant backdrop to the uneasy silence that lingered between them. Aminata had tried to keep her distance both physically and emotionally. She had always been guarded, but now in this unfamiliar space with someone she barely knew, the weight of his presence was overwhelming. Jarek was a commander, a figure of immense power, and she was nothing but a human maid, a symbol of everything the Zorvash Empire sought to suppress. What was it that made him act so differently? What had possessed him to risk his life to save hers? At first their conversations were minimal. Jarek would give her orders, practical things like finding a place to sleep or getting herself accustomed to the ship's layout. He never forced her to talk, but his presence was constant. He watched her from the corner of his eye, as if trying to understand the human he had chosen to save. Aminata, for her part, remained wary. She hadn't forgotten the system that had shaped Jarek, his status, his role in the brutal military force that had conquered her world. But there was something about him that intrigued her. He was different from the other Zorvash. She could feel it. It wasn't just the way he had saved her. It was the quiet sadness that seemed to follow him, the flickers of doubt in his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, while they sat in the ship's common area, Jarek spoke without any prompting. The room was dim, the soft glow of distant stars casting shadows on the walls. He stared out the viewport, his hands clasped in front of him as he leaned forward. "I've spent so much of my life following orders," Jarek said, his voice low and unsteady. "Commanding troops, securing victory after victory. But it's never felt right. Not truly. I've always known something was missing." Aminata watched him closely, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read him. There was a rawness in his words, something she hadn't expected from the stoic commander. Her curiosity was piqued, but she remained silent, not sure whether she should offer him the kind of compassion that his vulnerability seemed to invite. "You saved me," she finally said, her voice steady despite the swirling emotions inside her. "But why? Why me? There are millions of humans out there. Why risk everything for someone like me?" Jarek looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that made her heart race. "Because you're not just like the others," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't just survive. You resist. You stand strong even in the face of everything they've done to you." Aminata felt a pang in her chest. She hadn't seen herself that way. She had simply been trying to survive. But Jarek's words had a power to them. They spoke to something deeper within her, something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. She wasn't just a maid, wasn't just a tool in the hands of the Zorvash. She was a person, a human being with her own strength, her own will. "What makes you think I can resist?" she asked quietly. "What makes you think I can change anything?" Jarek's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Because you already are. Just by being here. By surviving. There's more strength in you than you realize. Aminata didn't know what to say to that. His words stirred something deep within her, but she wasn't sure what it was. She had spent so many years learning to bury her emotions, learning to keep her head down and avoid trouble. To hear someone tell her she had strength, was it even possible? The silence between them grew comfortable for the first time. The ship drifted through the endless void of space, its engines humming softly, as if the universe itself had slowed down to listen. It was in that quiet space that Aminata realized something. She wasn't just a pawn in this game. She wasn't just the sum of her past hardships, her struggles against an empire that had stripped away so much. There was a part of her, something she hadn't dared believe, that could rise above it all. And Jarek, for all his past, for all the power he wielded, was beginning to see that in her too. "Oh, you're not what I thought you were," Aminata said, her voice soft but steady. "But maybe neither am I." Jarek's gaze softened, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that neither of them could fully explain. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something that neither the Zorvash nor the Empire could take away. The days aboard Jarek's ship passed in a haze of conflicting emotions for Aminata. She had been given a measure of freedom, something she had never known under the Zorvash Empire's rule. But this newfound liberty came with a heavy weight. She wasn't used to open space or choice. The world had always been about surviving, about making it through each day without drawing attention. Now the idea of being able to make her own decisions, to have control over her own life, was both exhilarating and terrifying. She spent her days trying to adjust, learning about the ship's systems, and occasionally helping Jarek with tasks. Their conversations, though still cautious, became less strained as the days wore on. But despite the growing bond between them, the underlying tension remained, an invisible line neither of them dared to cross. Jarek was still a Zorvash commander. He had power, authority, and a past that had shaped him into the person he was. Aminata, on the other hand, was still a human, a woman raised to know her place in the galaxy, as a servant, as a lesser being in the eyes of the Empire. One evening they sat in the small dining area of the ship, a quiet meal between them. Aminata had become more comfortable with the food and the strange, sterile nature of their meals, but it wasn't the food that occupied her thoughts tonight. It was something more. "You've been quiet," Jarek remarked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. His voice, though steady, carried a hint of curiosity. Aminata looked up from her plate, meeting his gaze. "I'm just thinking," she replied, "about the worlds we've come from, the worlds we live in." Jarek nodded, as if he understood. But then, as if he had been pondering this for a while, he spoke again. "You said once that I was different from the others, from my people. Do you still think that?" Aminata paused, searching for the right words. It wasn't easy to articulate her thoughts, not when they were so new and complex. Her entire life had been spent under the shadow of oppression, of seeing everything through the lens of survival. But Jarek had stirred something in her, something she had never allowed herself to feel. The idea that there was more to life than merely existing. "I think—" She trailed off, trying to find the words. "I think that your people don't see us, see humans, as real people. Not as equals. I've learned that much, at least. And you're not like them. You saved me." "You didn't have to." Jarek's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her defenses. "I saved you because I believe you deserve more than the life you've been given. Because I believe that, despite everything, you can be more than just a tool in the hands of my empire. You can be free." His words echoed in Aminata's mind, their meaning slowly sinking in. She had never thought of herself as anything other than a servant, a victim of the Empire's iron grip. But now she was being told, by someone from the very system that had subjugated her, that she was capable of something more. "You're right," she said quietly. "But the world we come from isn't so simple. It's hard to believe in freedom when you've been told your whole life that you don't deserve it." Jarek's eyes softened. "I know," he said, his voice quieter now. "I understand, but that's why I'm here. That's why I want to change things, not just for you, but for everyone." The conversation hung between them, a fragile thread that connected their two worlds. Aminata's heart ached with the weight of his words, yet something inside her began to shift. There was a possibility here, a possibility she had never allowed herself to entertain before. She wasn't just a pawn in a game of intergalactic politics. She was a person with the power to change her own fate. But as they sat in silence, Aminata knew that this was just the beginning. Their worlds were so different, their experiences so far apart, that understanding each other would not come easily. Jarek's life had been built on a foundation of power, control, and conquest. Her life had been shaped by oppression, by being told she was less than human. Their cultures, their very identities, were at odds. But somehow, amidst the clash of those worlds, something new was being born. A connection, fragile but real. "I still don't understand you," Aminata said, her voice barely a whisper. Jarek gave a soft chuckle, though it lacked humor. "You're not supposed to," he replied. "But that's what makes this interesting, don't you think?" Aminata thought about that for a moment, the weight of their differences still heavy on her shoulders. But despite the growing tension between them, despite the cultural chasm they had yet to cross, she felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to understand each other and to change the world around them in the process. As the days passed, Jarek's decision to save Aminata began to ripple through the corridors of power within the Zorvash Empire. The quiet rebellion he had set in motion would not remain unnoticed. The Zorvash hierarchy, with its rigid system and unyielding control, was not accustomed to dissent, especially from one of their own. And Jarek, once a figurehead of that very system, had now become a symbol of defiance. It started with whispers, rumors that spread like wildfire through the ranks. The first time they reached Jarek, he had dismissed them as idle gossip. But the whispers soon became more than just idle chatter. His actions, his blatant disregard for the laws that governed the Zorvash, had caught the attention of those who held the reins of power. The higher-ups in the Zorvash military were not known for their mercy. They valued strength above all else, and weakness, whether perceived or real, was punished swiftly and without hesitation. Jarek had always known that. He had lived his life by that code, risen through the ranks because of it. But now the very thing that had once made him a respected leader was the thing that was going to destroy him. Aminata, on the other hand, remained unaware of the growing storm. She had been busy adjusting to her new life, uncertain of what her future held, but grateful for the reprieve Jarek had granted her. The quiet, peaceful days they spent aboard the ship, exchanging stories and learning about each other's cultures, were a balm for her wounded soul. She no longer felt like just a prisoner, a pawn in the hands of a ruthless empire. She felt seen, heard. But even as she grew closer to Jarek, even as the bond between them deepened, she sensed a shift in the air. Jarek, too, had become more distant in recent days. His once constant presence in her life had become erratic, and the familiar weight of his gaze seemed to carry a new, darker undertone. It was a subtle change at first. Jarek would retreat to his quarters more often, his mind preoccupied with something she couldn't quite place. And when he did speak, his words were measured, his tone guarded. The warmth that had characterized their earlier conversations seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a quiet, unspoken tension. Finally, one evening, it all came to a head. Aminata was alone in the ship's common area, lost in thought, when Jarek entered, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak at first, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her heart tighten. It was a look of someone caught between two worlds, a person who was being torn apart by forces beyond their control. "Jarek," she called softly, standing to face him. "What's going on? You've been different lately." Jarek hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the floor before returning to her. "I've been summoned," he said quietly, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "By the High Council. They've They've taken notice of my actions, and they don't take kindly to disobedience. Aminata's stomach churned. She had suspected something was amiss, but hearing the words out loud made it all too real. "What will they do to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jarek didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't know. But I can't go back. I can't just fall in line again. I refuse to." Aminata's heart skipped a beat. She knew that just by being near him, she had become a part of this rebellion, a symbol of his refusal to follow the orders of those in power. She had never asked for any of this, never wanted to be thrust into the heart of the Zorvash Empire's internal struggles. And yet here she was, a small part of something much larger than herself. "I won't let them take you," she said, her voice steady now, despite the fear that gripped her. "I'll help you. We'll figure this out together." Jarek's gaze softened, but the sadness in his eyes was undeniable. "I don't want to drag you into this, Aminata. This is my fight, not yours." She shook her head, stepping closer to him. "It's not just your fight anymore," she said firmly. "I'm in this with you, whether you want me to be or not." For a long moment, the two of them stood there in the quiet of the ship, the weight of their shared decision settling over them like a heavy cloak. The future was uncertain. The Zorvash Empire was vast and ruthless, and the High Council would not take kindly to Jarek's defiance. But Aminata's resolve was clear. She would stand by him, no matter the cost. "Thank you," Jarek whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." Aminata met his gaze, her heart racing. "I do," she said softly. "I do." The revelation came in the dead of night, when the ship was silent and the stars outside seemed to stretch endlessly, cold and distant. Aminata had been unable to sleep, her thoughts swirling, the uncertainty of their situation gnawing at her. Jarek had become more distant in the past few days, the weight of the High Council's impending judgment bearing down on him. Despite his insistence that she stay out of the conflict, Aminata knew that she had already become entangled in it. There was no escaping the path they were both walking now. And yet, as much as she feared the future, she could feel something stirring within her, something powerful, something undeniable. She was seated in the common area, staring out of the viewport, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, when Jarek approached. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he stood next to her, looking out at the stars, his face shadowed in the dim light. There was a tension in the air, something that neither of them had been able to ignore, something that had been building between them ever since they had met. For a long moment, neither spoke. It was as though the weight of the unspoken words hung between them, growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Jarek broke the silence. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, but with an intensity that sent a shiver down Aminata's spine. She turned to look at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice thick with the tension that had been building between them. "What do you feel?" Jarek took a step closer, his gaze locking with hers. The intensity in his eyes was almost too much to bear. "This connection between us, I can't explain it, but it's there. From the moment we met, I don't know what it is, but it's real." Aminata's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was saying. The feeling she had tried to ignore, the pull she had sensed but couldn't quite place, was not one-sided. Jarek felt it too. "You..." She stumbled over the words, her mind racing. "You think we're connected? But how?" Jarek's eyes softened, a flicker of something vulnerable flashing in his gaze. "I don't know, but I've never felt anything like this before. It's not just the attraction or the fact that we've been through so much together. It's something deeper, something that goes beyond just what's happened between us." Aminata's heart began to race. Her instincts screamed at her to pull away, to deny the connection, to tell herself it was just a fleeting moment, a side effect of the chaos they were both caught in. But deep down, a part of her knew it was real, that what she was feeling wasn't just in her head. It was in the air, in the way their words and actions seemed to intertwine, in the quiet moments when their gazes met and everything else fell away. "Do you believe in soulmates?" Jarek asked, his voice quiet, uncertain. The question hung in the air, And for a moment Aminata didn't know how to answer. She had never believed in such things. The idea of one person being fated for another seemed too abstract, too impossible in a world filled with so much pain, so much struggle. But as she looked into Jarek's eyes, she couldn't deny the connection she felt. It was as if something deep within her soul recognized something in him, something she had never felt with anyone else. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I did, but now with you I don't know what to think anymore." Jarek reached out slowly, his hand hovering just above hers, as if unsure whether to close the distance. "Aminata," he said, his voice barely a breath. "I don't know what's going to happen or how this will all end. But I know this. I can't imagine facing what's coming without you by my side." The vulnerability in his words, the raw emotion that flickered behind them, struck Aminata deeply. She had never seen this side of him before, the man who had always been so composed, so controlled. But now, in this quiet moment, Jarek was laying himself bare before her, exposing a part of himself that no one had ever seen. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if they would survive the forces that were closing in on them, or if the High Council would have its way. But in that moment, as she felt the weight of Jarek's words and the pull between them, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different. It was no longer heavy with unspoken questions. It was a silence filled with understanding, with a bond that neither of them could explain but both of them could feel. "I'm with you," she said quietly, her voice steady, her resolve clear. "No matter what happens, I'm with you." Jarek's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, Aminata saw something that resembled hope in his eyes. The tension aboard the ship had become palpable. Each passing day felt heavier, as though the very air around them was thickening with the weight of an inevitable confrontation. Jarek had always known that his defiance would not go unnoticed. The Zorvash Empire was a machine, and a machine that ran on power and control, with no room for weakness or dissent. Jarek had strayed from the path, and now the consequences were closing in on him. Despite the growing threat from the Empire, Jarek's resolve remained unshaken. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. But that didn't make the reality of the situation any easier. The High Council, with its countless layers of bureaucrats and military officials, had already begun to mobilize against him. The whispers had turned into more than just idle talk. They were now directives, commands sent from the highest echelons of power. Jarek couldn't ignore the severity of what was happening. His every action was being scrutinized, every movement dissected. The High Council had sent envoys to Xanthar, and their reports would soon reach their final destination. Their judgment would determine not just Jarek's fate, but that of Aminata as well. She had become a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not, of his rebellion, his refusal to follow the Empire's unyielding grip, and for that she would be punished. Jarek sat alone in the ship's command room, staring at the holographic map of the Zorvash territories. His mind raced through possible scenarios, trying to figure out how to escape the tightening noose of the Empire. Every plan he considered seemed inadequate, too flawed to be trusted. He couldn't win this by force alone. The Empire was too vast, its military too powerful. He needed something else, something more. And then Aminata entered the room, her footsteps quiet but certain. The sound of her presence grounded him in the reality of their situation. She had always been a reminder that there was something more than the military, more than the endless cycle of war. Her very existence had become a challenge to the Zorvash belief in superiority, a reminder that not all humans were weak, not all were to be subjugated. She stood by the doorway for a moment, her expression unreadable. Jarek knew she understood the weight of the situation, even if she didn't fully grasp the scope of what was happening. She had already seen enough of the Empire's cruelty to understand that they weren't just playing a game. But the moment that followed their eye contact was quiet, fraught with 1,000 unsaid things. She had become more than just someone Jarek had rescued. She was his ally, his equal in the fight, even if he hadn't fully realized how much she meant to him. "Aminata," Jarek said, his voice steady but filled with the unspoken tension that was building inside him. "We're running out of time. They won't wait much longer before they make their move. The High Council is preparing their response. We need to be ready." Aminata stepped into the room, her face set with determination. She had been quiet, observant in the past few days, but Jarek could see that she had been quietly planning too. She was stronger than he had given her credit for. "I know," she said softly, her voice unwavering. "But we can't just sit back and let them crush us. We have to do something." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right, of course. But how could they fight against an empire so vast, so entrenched in its ways? He had seen the power of the Zorvash military firsthand. The fleet was unstoppable. And now he was being asked to lead a rebellion, one that might not have a chance of succeeding. "We can't win this by force alone," Jarek admitted, his gaze falling to the floor. "They have too much power. But maybe we can change their minds, make them see that we aren't the enemies they think we are." Aminata crossed the room, closing the distance between them. "Then we fight in a different way," she said, her eyes unwavering. "We expose them. We show them that their empire is built on lies, on fear. If we can break their hold over the people, maybe we have a chance." Jarek looked up at her, his chest tight with a mix of admiration and uncertainty. She had a fire inside her, a determination that rivaled anything he had ever seen in the highest-ranking officers of the Zorvash. She was right, of course. They couldn't fight the Empire by matching its strength, but maybe they didn't need to. Perhaps the real power lay in shaking the foundations of the Empire itself, undermining its very reason for existence. For the first time in days, Jarek allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The High Council might have the power to destroy him, but they couldn't control everything. They couldn't control the hearts and minds of the people. And if they could convince enough of them that the Zorvash Empire was built on a foundation of oppression and lies, perhaps they had a chance. "This is it then," Jarek said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "We expose them. We fight the Empire not with weapons but with the truth." Aminata nodded. "Let's make them listen." In that moment, Jarek realized something crucial. The path ahead wasn't just about survival. It was about making a stand, not just for himself, but for every soul the Empire had crushed under its boot, and Aminata would be by his side every step of the way. The atmosphere aboard the ship had shifted. What had once been a quiet rebellion, a silent act of defiance led by Jarek, had now become something more. Aminata had given him the courage to believe they could stand against the Zorvash Empire, not with weapons, but with a power that was far more dangerous, the truth. They had spent the last few days in intense preparation, gathering what resources they could from the ship, communicating with various factions within the galaxy who had suffered at the hands of the Empire. Jarek's influence, his position within the military, had afforded him access to a network of contacts, though many had been silent in their support, afraid of the Empire's reach. But with Aminata at his side, that silence was beginning to break. Aminata had quickly proven herself to be a strategic mind in her own right. She was quick to learn the intricacies of their plan, able to connect the dots in ways Jarek hadn't considered. Together they had formulated a strategy to undermine the Zorvash's hold on Xanthar, to reveal to the galaxy that the Empire's iron grip wasn't as unshakable as they believed. The first step was to expose the truth. The High Council had kept countless atrocities hidden from the public eye, using their military might to suppress any knowledge of the suffering they caused. But the people of the galaxy were not blind, and many of them, especially those oppressed by the Empire, had been waiting for a spark, for someone to show them the way. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Aminata said, her voice sharp with determination as she looked over the holographic map of the galaxy. The glow from the map illuminated her face, highlighting the intensity of her expression. "The military strongholds, the inner workings of their most powerful fleets. If we can expose the truth of their operations, we can destabilize them." Jarek nodded, his gaze fixed on the plan she had drawn out. It was bold, risky, but it was their best shot. "We strike at the heart of their propaganda," he said quietly. "We find the evidence, leak it to the public, and we make sure the galaxy knows the Zorvash aren't the benevolent rulers they claim to be." But even as the plan took shape, Jarek knew the consequences. The High Council would not tolerate such a disruption. If they succeeded in spreading the truth, they would be hunted, marked as traitors and enemies of the Empire. The fear of that inevitable consequence gnawed at him, but the fire in Aminata's eyes, the certainty with which she spoke, kept him grounded. They had come too far to back down now. "We'll need to be fast," Jarek said, pacing the room as he processed the risk. "If they catch wind of what we're planning, we'll be hunted before we can even act. The people have to believe the truth, or else this is all for nothing." Aminata's eyes were steady as she turned to face him. "The truth is on our side, Jarek," she said, her voice unwavering. "People can see lies for what they are, especially when it's exposed. We're not just fighting the Empire, we're fighting for every person they've oppressed." Jarek's heart stirred at her words. The reality of their situation was heavy, the risks immense, but the power of what they were trying to do was undeniable. It wasn't just about saving themselves, it was about igniting a spark, a movement that could change the course of history. This was their fight for freedom, not just for them, but for everyone who had suffered under the Zorvash's reign. In the following hours, the crew, small but growing in number, prepared for the mission. They would target a Zorvash supply station, one that was connected to the military's communications network. From there, they could hack into the Empire's encrypted files and retrieve the data that would expose the lies. Aminata worked alongside Jarek, her hands steady as she assisted in preparing the equipment. Their camaraderie was now undeniable. What had started as a fragile alliance had blossomed into a partnership of equals. The bond between them had deepened, not just out of necessity, but out of shared conviction. They were not just allies in a war. They were companions fighting for the same future. As they set the plan into motion, there was no turning back. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air, but there was also a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. Jarek turned to Aminata, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "No matter what happens, we're in this together." Aminata gave him a small but resolute smile, her eyes locked with his. Together. The moment stretched between them, a silent promise of solidarity and strength. They both knew the risks, but in that brief exchange, they also knew they were fighting for something greater than themselves. The ship's engines hummed to life as the mission began. The fight for freedom had truly begun. The air was electric with tension as Jarek and Aminata made their final preparations. Their target, the Zorvash military stronghold, was within reach. Every moment felt like it could tip either way, success or destruction. The information they had stolen, the evidence that could expose the Empire's corruption, was now in their hands. But getting it into the right hands, where it could spark the revolution they needed, was a far more dangerous task than anything they had faced so far. The ship's engines hummed steadily, a low, reassuring sound that contrasted with the chaos inside Jarek's mind. He was calm on the surface, but inside, the uncertainty gnawed at him. This mission had the potential to change the galaxy forever, but it could also destroy everything he had worked for. If they failed, if the Empire discovered their plan, it would not only be the end of their rebellion, but the end of any hope for humanity's future under the Zorvash Empire. Aminata, standing beside him in the ship's command room, was focused. Her eyes were sharp, her movements deliberate as she ran through the final checks. It was clear that the burden of this mission weighed on both of them, but there was something in her resolve that kept Jarek grounded. Her strength, her conviction, everything about her told him that no matter how impossible this seemed, they had a shot. "You ready?" Jarek asked, turning to her. Aminata met his gaze, her face calm but determined. "We don't have a choice," she said simply. "We either take this risk, or we let them keep oppressing everyone else. We've already come too far to turn back." Her words hit him like a surge of electricity. She was right. They had already made their choice. There was no turning back now. As the ship approached the Zorvash stronghold, The lights in the control room dimmed, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. Every movement felt amplified, every sound echoed in the vast emptiness of space. Jarek knew that once they entered the stronghold's atmosphere, the clock would start ticking. There would be no second chances, no room for error. "Let's do this," Jarek muttered as he initiated the final sequence. Aminata nodded, a slight, determined smile on her lips. "Together," she affirmed. The ship descended into the military base's atmosphere, cutting through the sky with surgical precision. The stronghold loomed in front of them, a massive fortress of metal and technology, filled with soldiers, weapons, and the oppressive force of the Zorvash Empire. It was the very heart of their military might, and now it was their battleground. As they landed, the sound of the ship's engines fading into the background, the adrenaline hit. Jarek and Aminata suited up, their movements quick and practiced. The mission was simple in theory: extract the data, expose the Empire's atrocities to the galaxy, and get out before they were caught. But simple and easy were two very different things. "To remember," Jarek said, his voice low and urgent, "we stick to the plan. We get the data, we broadcast it, and we leave. No heroics." Aminata gave him a knowing look. "We're not here to be heroes. We're here to make sure the truth gets out." The two of them moved out, blending into the shadows of the compound as they slipped past guards and security checkpoints. The base was teeming with Zorvash soldiers, their presence a constant reminder of the might they wielded. But Jarek and Aminata were swift, their movements calculated. The data they had stolen would expose the military's darkest secrets, the atrocities they had hidden for so long. And now, with every step they took, they were one step closer to giving the galaxy a chance at freedom. But as they neared the central command center, the alarms blared. They had been discovered. "Shit," Jarek muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "They're onto us." "We've got no time," Aminata said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the command center's doors. "We've got to get this out now." The blast doors opened with a hiss and they rushed inside, heading straight for the central terminal. With minutes to spare, they uploaded the data, broadcasting it across every communication network in the galaxy. "Done," Jarek said, his voice tight with urgency. "Let's go." But as they turned to leave, they were met by a wall of armed Zorvash soldiers, their weapons raised and ready. Jarek and Aminata exchanged a glance. The fight was inevitable now. There would be no easy escape. But in that moment, as the soldiers advanced, neither of them hesitated. They had come too far, and they would not let fear stop them now. With a surge of determination, they stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. They had exposed the truth. They had defied the Empire. And no matter the outcome, they knew they had changed the course of history forever. The gunfire echoed through the hallways of the Zorvash stronghold, a stark contrast to the silence that had filled the air just moments before. Jarek and Aminata fought side by side, their movements fluid, their minds locked into the shared purpose that had brought them here, to expose the truth and to bring down the empire that had enslaved countless worlds, including their own. The soldiers closing in on them were numerous, but the truth they had broadcasted to the galaxy had already begun to shift the tides. Aminata's heart pounded in her chest as she fired, her hands steady even as the chaos around them intensified. She could hear the cries of soldiers falling, but her focus never wavered. This was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a fight for a future where humanity and countless other species could live without the crushing weight of oppression. "Keep moving!" Jarek shouted over the noise, pulling her toward the exit. The plan was simple: get out, regroup, and find a way to get the truth into the hands of those who could rally others to their cause. But the reality of the situation was anything but simple. The Zorvash military was powerful, and their reach was vast. As they rounded a corner, Aminata caught sight of the security console. It was their only way out, a last-minute attempt to disable the base's lockdown and give them a chance to escape. She sprinted toward it, her mind racing with thoughts of everything that could go wrong. She reached it just as a blast ricocheted off the wall beside her. The force threw her off balance, but she gritted her teeth and continued. Her hands flew over the console, desperately typing in commands to override the system. "Come on," she muttered to herself, the pressure mounting with every passing second. If they didn't get the system down now, the Empire would trap them in the stronghold, and the entire mission would be for nothing. Almost there, she said, breathing heavily. Her fingers paused on the final command, hesitating for just a moment. The weight of what they were doing hung over her like a storm cloud. If they succeeded, everything they'd fought for would be exposed. But if they failed... A blast sounded from down the hall, jolting her back into focus. There was no time to second-guess. With a final stroke, she hit the last key. The alarms ceased, the security doors clicked open, and for a brief moment silence reigned. Done. Aminata exhaled, a wave of relief rushing over her. But before she could turn to Jarek, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. They weren't alone anymore. "Let's go," Jarek said, his voice grim but urgent. They didn't have much time. They made their way through the compound's back corridors, the sounds of pursuing soldiers growing louder with every step. But Aminata's mind was elsewhere, on the broadcast they had initiated. The truth was already out there, and the Empire's lies could no longer be hidden. That was their victory, no matter what happened next. As they reached the exit, Jarek took one last glance at Aminata. His eyes, full of determination, met hers. There was no fear there, only the hard, undeniable truth of their actions. "We did it," Jarek said, a quiet but proud smile crossing his face. Aminata didn't smile. The truth they had exposed had come at a heavy price. They had stirred the hornet's nest, and now the Zorvash Empire would retaliate with all its might. The fight was far from over, and the consequences of their actions were yet to be fully realized. But as the doors to the outside world opened and the cold night air hit their faces, Aminata felt a sense of resolve settle deep within her. This was the beginning of something far greater than they had ever imagined. The rebellion had begun, and the Empire would have to reckon with the power of truth, a power they could no longer suppress. Together they would face whatever came next. The road ahead would be dangerous and uncertain, but for the first time in years, Aminata could see the possibility of a future beyond survival. A future where freedom was no longer a dream, but a reality they had fought for, and would continue to fight for, no matter the cost. And so, they left the stronghold behind, walking into the unknown, side by side. The battle for freedom had just begun. The galaxy had changed. The words had spread like wildfire. The truth, once buried beneath layers of lies, had emerged into the light, exposing the heart of the Zorvash Empire for all to see. The broadcast that Jarek and Aminata had risked their lives for had sparked a revolution. It was not the kind of revolution that began with explosions and armies clashing in the streets, but a quiet storm, a shift in the minds of countless beings who now understood the price of the Empire's rule. The war was far from over, but the first cracks in the Zorvash Empire's facade had appeared, and they were not easily repaired. Those who had once been too afraid to act were now speaking out, demanding change, standing up for the freedom they had been denied for so long. The movement, small at first, was beginning to grow, fueled by the courage of those who had dared to defy the Empire. For Jarek and Aminata, the fight had only just begun. They had exposed the truth, but there was still so much to be done. The Empire would retaliate. The High Council would not simply let them go, would not allow this defiance to go unanswered. They knew that the road ahead would be fraught with dangers, battles, betrayals, and the looming threat of the Empire's wrath. But in the quiet moments, as they stood side by side looking out over the stars from the safety of their new hideout, there was a sense of peace between them. It wasn't the kind of peace that meant the war was over. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing they had made a difference, knowing that in that one moment they had taken a stand for something larger than themselves. Aminata was different now. She had seen the darkness of the universe, had felt the weight of oppression on her shoulders for most of her life. But now she stood with Jarek, not just as an ally, but as a leader in her own right. She had found her place, her voice, and it was a voice that could not be silenced. "Do you think we can really win this?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a quiet conviction. Jarek turned to her, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we can't stop now. We've already changed everything." Aminata nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars outside. "Then we fight for the future," she said, her voice steady. "For the ones who can't fight for themselves yet, for the ones who will join us when they see what's possible." Jarek's heart swelled with pride. He had never imagined that a simple act of defiance could change so much, but he had learned something important on this journey. Power doesn't always lie in strength or force. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is truth. The truth they had revealed had already begun to shift the balance of power in the galaxy. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and that was its greatest mistake. "We'll keep going," Jarek said, his voice steady and resolute. "No matter what happens, we'll keep fighting together." Aminata turned to him, her eyes filled with a determination that mirrored his own. "Together," she echoed, her voice filled with a quiet strength. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their decisions settling between them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt within reach. They had shown the galaxy that the Zorvash Empire's rule was not absolute, that they could stand against it. And as the stars outside seemed to stretch on forever, they both knew that their fight would continue, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of the Empire's rule. The beginning of the end was now in motion, and it was just the start of a new chapter.